This time, on the Plutopia podcast, we suspend our disbelief and explore the worlds of fantasy and science fiction. Author Adam Roberts joins the Plutopians as we discuss his new book, Fantasy, A Short History. Suspending your disbelief means intentionally setting aside logic and critical thinking to accept the impossible or improbable. The Plutopia co-hosts are eminently qualified for that task.
I think it may be that cinema is becoming more like video games, and it's more about particular special effects, spectacular. That's diminishing, I think, as for the art form, because video games are necessarily structured by the obstacles that you put in the way of the player. The player overcomes the obstacles and gets to the end of the stage and beats the big boss, and that's a rather kind of denuded way of thinking about the possibilities of storytelling. But then I also think that it's a game like Skyrim is, you can do anything at all in that. You can fight dragons and you can go on adventures and quests, or you can just live in a village and just explore what the possibilities of that are. And that's rare. It's rare certainly in cinema, but even in book form, where there usually is a more linear conflict that has to be overcome.
Hey, welcome everybody to the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm John Lebkowski, one of your co-hosts. I'm joined by the other co-hosts, Scoop Sweeney and Wendy Grossman. And our guest today is Adam Roberts, an award-winning British science fiction and fantasy novelist. He also teaches English literature and creative writing at Royal Holloway, University of London. And he's a prolific author with published works including at least 24 novels plus novellas, short stories, parodies, criticism. And his latest book, which is in the criticism category, and we're kind of going to focus on this today, it's called Fantasy, A Short History. And it was kind of a longish short history.
Yeah, I've got to hold my hand up there. It wasn't as long as I would have liked, if I'm honest, but eventually the publishers pulled the bar down and said, no, that's enough.
You know, the similar book I have is The World Beyond the Hill by Alexei and Corey Panchin, which is a history of science fiction, and it's a monster. So,
Well, it's kind of interesting. I've been exploring your book, and I was mentioning to Scoop and Wendy earlier that a couple of days ago I saw this new Avatar film, Avatar: Fire and Ash, and I was realizing that I was seeing a kind of blend of fantasy and science fiction. But I know there's a difference. How would you articulate the difference between fantasy and science fiction?
So there's a long, complicated, and I'm afraid boring answer to that, or there's just a kind of short answer. We all recognize it when we see it, don't we? And one of the arguments I previously wrote a history of science fiction, and I write science fiction. You've kindly said I write science fiction and fantasy, but I've never actually published any fantasy. Although I love reading fantasy, I grew up reading fantasy, but science fiction is what I do. And I wrote a history of science fiction that dated that genre from about the 17th century. It's a product of the Renaissance and the development of modern science, and it extrapolates ideas from scientific premises or pseudo-scientific premises. Fantasy is a much larger beast, because, as I say in the book, it's the default storytelling mode of human beings. Now, some of the stories we tell, some of the novels that are published are realist, are kind of mimetic. They're recognizable portraits of the world we actually live in. But by far, the majority of stories contain stuff that is not in the world, that is fantastical, that are monsters or magic or transcendent things that are more than the world is. And that's the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that's Homer, and that's Beowulf, and medieval romances, and most of the stories. I mean, they're fantastic stories. That's why we love them. So I suppose I would say, and to answer your question, science fiction is kind of a subset of fantasy, a particular kind of fantasy that tries to cleave to science as it's been developed over the last 4 or 5 centuries. But fantasy is still going very strong. I mean, the Avatar movies are very interesting, aren't they? The more we go into that world, the more it leaves science behind. It becomes more about kind of magic and divinity and kind of fantastical things. Did you like the movie?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of amazing. I saw it on a high quality IMAX screen, and of course, it was in 3D and it was at 60 frames per second. So it was completely immersive, and it really was as though we were in that reality. And the fantasy aspects of it sort of draw on indigenous thinking quite a bit. So there's that aspect of it too. And I think from watching the Avatar films, um, because they were inspired somewhat by the conflict between colonialists and indigenous people, you get a better understanding of indigenous people and their culture, even though it's a kind of fantasized indigenous culture. How about you? What did you think of it?
I had more mixed response. I mean, my memory of seeing the first Avatar was kind of what you're saying. In fact, I took my daughter, who then was, I think, 8 or 9 years old, and we saw it on the big screen. It wasn't an IMAX, but it was a big cinema screen, and she got kind of overwhelmed by it. It was so kind of full on, so colorful, so immersive, so large. I had to take her out of the cinema for a while to calm down, and it was an amazing experience. I think the second and the third movies are just retreading that. I mean, there may be interesting stuff about, indigenous cultures, like you say, about colonialism, about the way the West is kind of extractively taking elements from all around the world. And it's interesting to think what you gain by telling that story through the medium of fantasy, rather than just telling a straightforward story about, about the American West. So what is it Dances with Wolves doesn't have, as it were, that a film like Avatar does?
I don't know. I was going to say that just to be contrarian, the screenwriter William Goldman used to say that the sequels were horrors movies because the original, there would be a creative pulse and the sequel was only done for money. So I'm not surprised if the sequel was not as interesting.
Well, the way I saw this sequel was that it was an extension of the character development, really. You got deeper into the characters that they were presenting. There's a lot of action. It's kind of a shoot 'em up, um, and it's meant to be an action movie more than anything else. But they do kind of dig more deeply into the characters, and I found that somewhat compelling. Though I agree with you, it is kind of a retread of what we have already seen before in the other Avatar movies. And there's two more
Oh,
in planning now.
but do you
So
have any sense? Do you have any sense that the movies were originally intended to be like a trilogy or a quadrology or a quintology or whatever you call it?
are
I
you
don't.
asking me or Adam?
Well, I was asking you because you were speaking, but Adam can
Oh,
answer if he wants.
I think it was originally planned as at least a trilogy.
Okay. Well, that's fair enough.
I think Cameron was a bit blindsided by the sheer success of the first movie. It's the highest grossing movie that's ever been made, and I think he enjoys working with that toolbox. He enjoys creating these worlds. So he's now. It was off the back of that first movie, I think, that he announced there would be five, which seems like a lot. And it's not just it is a bit repetitive. It's also a very long film. It's 3 hours of bang, 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 and this extraordinary palette of technicolor. Everything's kind of assaulting the eyes and assaulting the ears. And I did find it, I mean, I'm getting older, unlike the rest of you. I'm declining into the veil of years, and I found it a bit um, tiresome, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I think there is something interesting in a broader sense about the urge to repeat, which is part of popular culture more generally, but is particularly a part of fantasy. So I wrote this history of fantasy, and I thought, I've read a lot of fantasy. I read a lot of fantasy when I was growing up. I've read Tolkien over and over. I haven't quite kept up with fantasy in the 90s and the noughties and the 2010s, but how hard can that be? I'll read some books. And it was diving into that world made me realize they're all enormous. They're all 1,000 pages, and they're all 12-book sequences. It's like, it's not enough to tell a story. You have to have a sequel, and then another sequel, and then a trilogy, and then a trilogy of trilogies. And there's something almost, I mean, it's going to sound a bit derogatory, but there's something almost psychopathological about the urge to repeat. You can't just make Star Wars. You have to make endless versions of Star Wars that are basically telling the same story over and over and over again.
I really think Goldman explained it pretty well.
Yeah, it sounds like the Avatar producers fell into the Lucasfilm trap, because originally it was just a simple little, shoot 'em up space movie that made a lot of money. And when you make a lot of money in Hollywood, you are required to continue feeding that money machine as long. And I think it has gone on to infinity, but there's so many Star Wars spin-offs, and I see Avatar headed in that direction.
But isn't there a historical precedent though also? I mean, you have a chapter on Victorian stuff, but you don't, as far as I could tell, you didn't mention the famous 3-volume novel of Victorian era, which seems to me a pretty reasonable predecessor of fantasy trilogies too.
The triple decker, yeah. I mean, it's there aren't so many fantasy books published as triple deckers in the 19th century. The triple decker is an interesting publishing phenomenon which came about.
But Dickens published 3-volume novels.
He did. Yeah. He published. Dickens was a bit sui generis because he was so popular. Most Victorian writers who weren't working in the mode of fantasy would publish big novels in 3 volumes, and there was a particular reason for that, which is readers would not generally, unless they were very wealthy, would not generally buy books outright. They would subscribe to public libraries, and you would borrow a book. It would cost you money to subscribe. They weren't free libraries. And a triple decker could be loaned to 3 separate people at the same time. So the library made more money. So the publisher was able to sell more copies to the library.
So it was kind of like streaming.
Yeah, no, it kind of was. That's right. It was just a way of kind of marketing these stories. And there was a sense, I mean, there was no telly, there was no cinema. People liked to read very long stories, and they didn't make them laugh, make them cry, make them wait, as Charles Lever famously said about writing a Victorian novel. Now, the fantasy thing is quite interesting, because one of the arguments I made, I don't want to keep dragging it back to my novel, to my critical history, but I am interested in. So having said that fantasy is kind of the default storytelling mode of humanity, I could have written a history of fantasy that went all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, but that would have been a very large book indeed. So I'm interested in kind of genre fantasy, what we think of, what's shelved in bookshops as fantasy, which is kind of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and all the imitators of Tolkien. And that's a 20th century phenomenon, but it has roots in the 19th century. And the roots that I talk about in the history are the Victorian fascination with kind of medieval culture, children's books like the Alice books or Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, which are fantastical, but these weren't triple deckers. And I also talk about the huge success of the Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which was a couple of centuries earlier, but which became a huge kind of enormous global bestseller in the 19th century. And I say a little bit about Wagner and the Ring Cycle, and these are all William Morris. These all sort of feed into the creation of distinctively genre fantasy in the 20th century.
Yeah, I was unaware of William Morris. I have an urge to read him based on what you had written. But one of my questions is, at what point in this long history, or somewhat long history of fantasy, did the genre sort of become aware of itself as a genre? Did they start talking about fantasy as a specific genre?
Yeah, there's a simple answer to that, which is that it was 2 things, and it happened at the end of the 1960s and in the 1970s. And those 2 things were the enormous success of Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings published 1954-55, so it takes 10, 15 years for it to become a bestseller, but it becomes a bestseller when it's released as a paperback in the States and becomes a campus novel, and then suddenly everyone's reading it. And off the back of the sudden success, the kind of out of the blue success of Tolkien in the later 60s, Ballantine put out their adult fantasy list. And the adult fantasy list, which was famously edited by Lynn Carter, it began by reprinting The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and various other titles by Tolkien. And then it reprinted a couple of other older books. So it did the Mervyn Peake Gormenghast and Dunsany and various writers who had been writing kind of fantastical stories in the 1920s and 1930s. And the Ballantine list was a huge hit, a huge success. And then through the 70s, a kind of appetite for fantasy was created. And then in the 80s and 90s, thousands of writers start writing in that mode, and it becomes a really, really big deal. And that's one of the questions which I wasn't able to answer to my own satisfaction when writing the book, because there seems to be something interesting in the kind of belatedness of that. So the kind of key figures like Lord Dunsany, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, these were men who fought in the British Army in World War One in the trenches. Tolkien was invalided home. As he said afterwards, all but one of my friends was killed in the war. So they were writing. It took Tolkien a long time to write anything. So he was writing through the 20s and 30s. He published his The Hobbit in 1937, and then it takes him until the 50s to finish The Lord of the Rings. C.S. Lewis writes the Narnia books, and they come out in the 1950s. Dunsany publishes in the 20s, but he doesn't really become famous until he's reprinted by Ballantine. So one of the arguments I make then is that these fantasy novels are re-enchantments of a disenchanted world, the world of industrial modernity, which was given particular focus by the horrors of mechanical war and on the Western Front in World War One. And these writers retreat to a more magical, more chivalric, kind of marvelous world and tell their stories. And I can sort of understand that as a reaction against what had happened. What I don't understand is why it then took so many decades for that to filter through into the mainstream, why the books that were being worked on in the 1920s and 30s didn't become successful and famous until the 60s and 70s. What it is about that kind of gap, how we explain that, or what it was about the 60s and 70s that made fantasy suddenly kind of emerge.
Well, there was a depression and then another world war. And
That's true.
There was a lot going on. I was interested in some of the names I didn't find, like Ursula Le Guin, who did write a trilogy and with wizards in it, and Octavia Butler and Anne McCaffrey, who I always thought of as writing fantasy.
So I talk about Le Guin a fair bit. I
managed to miss it somehow.
Yeah, no,
I'm sorry.
It's my natural English diffidence. I'm burying the lead in various ways. No, I do talk about Le Guin. I revere Le Guin. I think Le Guin is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, and I think her fantasy is extraordinary. And she takes a Tolkienian premise and she writes it in a particular way. Octavia Butler, I suppose we would call her a fantasy writer, would we? I think of her as science fiction. That goes back to kind of John's original question, doesn't it? There becomes a sort of demarcation question. I do talk about McCaffrey in the Dragon books and about
dragons. I'm not finding me. For some reason, I couldn't find them. I will admit I was actually actively looking for them as opposed to reading every page. So,
well, did you get I suppose what did I do? I sent you a PDF of the proofs.
Yes, you did.
You wouldn't have had the index.
So maybe that's it.
You can look in the index and find them. But I mean, maybe I probably should have done more.
It's my fault, but I'm glad to know that they're there.
Well, they're there, but it's also you make a very good point, which is and I kind of wrestled with this a bit as I was writing it. I'm working with quite a traditionalist definition of what fantasy is, to go back to John's original question, which is it clusters around the particular impact of especially Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and all the people who write in imitation of that. And that's quite kind of masculine coded in lots of ways, where there are lots of great writers of fantasy who are women, and fantasy becomes a space in which you can kind of explore all sorts of possibilities.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people would say that would think of fantasy as a kind of a women's genre and science fiction as a male genre, but I've always been more interested in science fiction because I'm interested in the speculative side of it, of what if you carry this scientific principle or this technological idea to an extreme, what do you get, and what are the societal impacts? I mean, that interests me even as we sit here speculating about the future of AI, which is not science fiction but futurism. you know, whereas fantasy doesn't seem to me to get you very anywhere sort of. Yeah, I mean, I may enjoy it, but it doesn't stimulate the same kind of discussion, I think. But
Well,
Well, there's
sometimes
a,
you have fantasy that's dressed as science fiction too.
well, that's true. That's true.
yeah, and that's obviously that's the case. I suppose it's the question of whether we think of science fiction by definition is kind of forward-looking and therefore kind of progressive, whereas fantasy is retrogressive because it's an idealized version of the past. It's a pre-industrial world. It's a kind of medievalized world, let's say, and that there are reasons why you might not want to go back to the medieval period if you are a
Well, I
woman or a
certainly
person of
wouldn't want to
color.
give up, as I was saying the other week when we had Deborah Hyde. I would certainly wouldn't want to go back to a world without dental anesthetic.
Yeah, yes. It was Terry Pratchett's line, wasn't it? Central
Was it?
heating and
I didn't
dentistry.
realize.
It just occurred to me that so where would you place in this something like the films of Hayao Miyazaki? They're clearly fantasy, but they're not exactly fantasy in the mode that we've been talking about. Am I correct in that?
No, absolutely, yeah. And
Yeah.
they're coming out of a different cultural tradition, aren't they? So that's another. I mean, it's not exactly. It doesn't exactly ward off criticism to call my book a short history. I would have liked to have written a much longer book, and the focus of my short history is a little bit. It's a bit European and North American. The last
Yeah,
chapter
I can.
the last chapter does try and encompass the fact that fantasy is now a global phenomenon, but there are traditions of Japanese fantasy storytelling that go back a long way, and Chinese as well. And that it's harder to fit that into a particular narrative about the like Weberian Max Weber's disenchantment thesis, which is when he says this is what modernity and capitalism and industrialization does. It disenchants us, it takes the magic out of life. So the argument I make in the book is that fantasy becomes a way in which we can kind of re-enchant our lives. And in that I also draw on the great Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor in his book A Secular Age. So he says something quite interesting, I think, which is he can take that once upon a time we lived a more enchanted world and there was magic in the world, but that was inspiring and wonderful, but also kind of terrifying, because that means there are monsters in the world and there are strange things living in the woods, and witches might steal your soul and so on. And what we've done with modernity is, the phrase he uses is, we have buffered our sensibility so that we no longer think in those terms. We no longer think there are bogles living in the woods and that strange magic is going to afflict us, or we live in this kind of rational scientific mind. But that means we've lost the enchantment and the magic as well. So fantasy, by that logic, becomes a kind of safe space where we can re-enchant the world without facing kind of existential terrors that come with living in an actually enchanted world.
Well, this makes me think about the difference in the way a child thinks and an adult thinks. And as you grow older and more experienced, uh, you have a disenchantment too. As a child, you see things kind of with a magical sensibility because you just don't know better, and you don't have the cognitive tools to interpret the world in the way that you will, years later. And I suppose that that's just part of human evolution, right? That we have evolved away from enchantment to disenchantment.
You think that's an inevitable part of growing up? It's a question of whether that's a kind of maturity or whether that's just a loss. I don't know if you know Wordsworth's great poem, the Ode, Intimations of Immortality, when he says, when I was a child, I caught a glimpse of this marvelous world. Every meadow, grove, and stream was apparelled in celestial light. And all that's happened to me is I've lost that, and I'm no longer in touch with that beauty and that transcendent wonder. And
So that's
for
like Peter
Wordsworth, that's a
Pan.
terrible shame,
So that's like Peter Pan as well.
Well, Peter Pan's a strange work, isn't it? Because Peter Pan is the child who never grows up. So I suppose he's forever enchanted. He's forever playing.
Mary Poppins has that too. There's
Mm.
the idea of the baby that can talk to animals and understand birds and stuff, and then they lose that when they learn to speak.
Mm.
Earlier, you were wondering why these great fantasy novels were not extremely popular until the 60s and 70s. And I was living in Berkeley in the late 60s and 70s, and that was a very youth culture, hippie culture thing. And all of a sudden, Tolkien was just everywhere. I had friends who were dressing in the mode of the characters. I'm like, where did this come from? But there was also a certain drug-induced thing going on as well, and I think maybe some of that, people were getting their fantasies from drugs as well as from fantasy novels.
Yeah, I think that's clearly part of it, isn't it? And it was a very striking and rather strange thing for Tolkien. It was a conservative upper middle class English Catholic to suddenly discover that he was kind of adored by all these countercultural hippie types. I mean, that was part of that kind of cultural moment, and I suppose fantasy feeds into that. It wasn't just Tolkien, although, as you say, Tolkien was huge. It was also the music of the time, which very often kind of veers fantastical, and it's no longer just 3-minute pop songs about being in love. It's all sorts of kind of weird and strange things. I mean, the Avatar films, as I'm not the first person to note this, look like Roger Dean's covers to Yes albums from the 70s. It's like this weird, strange world that drugs give you access to. But I wonder why. I'm interested in that as well, as to why that particular countercultural movement, which was culturally really, really influential and successful, why that happened when it happened. Because it's nearly, it's 2 decades after the end of World War II.
But that's exactly it. It was the people who were born just after the war, who grew up in peacetime, who grew up in increasing affluence, and who didn't see the point of their parents' conformity. And so everybody, I don't think there's much secret in it. I mean, I think every generation rebels against its parents in some way, and that was the rebellion of its day.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I mean, we're still kind of living in the aftermath of that particular cultural explosion, though. And it's not that people are still, in a large sense, kind of hippies and countercultural types anymore.
Well,
but
some people are.
Some people are, but I suppose the point I make is that the music and the literature and some of the films from that epoch are still kind of current.
Yes.
People are still saying smash the state, but it's a different set of people.
Yeah, and also there were a lot of new things at the time, just as there are a lot of new things now. But the electric guitars were new, synthesizers were new. Being able to there were new sounds available to people. There were new colors available to people. Dayglow was invented then. There were just suddenly a lot of new options, and I think some of that was exploring those. But I was going to ask you if you talk a little bit about fantasy and fascism. And I thought maybe you could say something about it, but also, you were talking about the reaction, fantasy coming up when it did, and putting new magic in the world. What do you think fantasy will look like in the post-Trump world?
They're going to be a post-Trump world. We can look
Let's
forward
assume
to
that. Let's say there is.
I think he might turn into the giant worm from God Emperor June. Rule America.
I think he's just as mortal as everybody.
No,
but
of course he is. Yeah.
And the point is the pendulum always swings. Things do change somehow. So there will be a post-Trump world. We don't know what it'll look like. So, but what will how will fantasy put magic back into the world at that time?
Yeah, I mean, by putting the emphasis on enchantment or re-enchantment, as I do in my thesis, I'm kind of cutting across what some other critics of fantasy as a mode focus on. So they tend to focus on the kind of societal representation, and fantasy societies are very often traditional pre-industrial societies. So they're often very hierarchical. There'll be, kings and emperors and princes. There are very often stories of war. I mean, fascism is in a way, quite a puzzling ideology, because it simultaneously, the fascist ideology looks back to a valorized past, often a legendary past, and wants to turn the clock back and to make things the way they used to be. But it's also kind of in love with brilliant new technology. And that's also part of the kind of Mussolini, kind of Hitler idea, which I think you do see with Trump. He just wants to build fantastic new warships and giant space fleets. And that's the science fictional side of it, which you might think is kind of contradicting the traditionalist old school. Let's go back to the way society used to be before all this diversity and all the globalization and so on. But the fascism as an ideology holds the two things together. I don't know. It's a very, I mean, I'm interested in, I mean, it's funny that we're coming at it this way, because you're quite right. All of you are quite right. That the big kind of impulse that turned fantasy into a kind of global literature and made it as popular as it now is, came out of a kind of countercultural movement, a kind of progressive moment. Whereas a lot of the fantasy that is still kind of current and that is still determining the sorts of books that are getting written are conservative, a small c conservative. C.S. Lewis writes Christian allegories, and Tolkien was a conservative Catholic. So there's, I mean, that's not the same thing as being fascist, but I think that traditionalist ethos kind of pulls in interesting directions against what the appeal of these stories are. I don't know.
mean, there's certainly a lot of authoritarian realms within, say, the Game of Thrones and that series of books.
Yeah, and that's another question which I never quite answered to my own satisfaction. That, I mean, so I grew up, let's say in the 1970s, reading Tolkien. I read Tolkien obsessively, and one of the things that I think, looking back, I was getting out of it was an escape from my kind of boring suburban English childhood into a much more exciting and magical realm. And I do think there's I mean, that's another Ursula Le Guin quotation about people mock escapism, but if you think about it, who is it that hates escape? It's jailers. It's a good thing to escape from the world that we live in. And I can remember thinking as a child, I really wanted to go to Middle Earth, and it seemed so much more exciting and wonderful than East Kent, where I grew up. But then one of the big kind of fantasy phenomena of the 21st century is what they call grimdark, which is, Game of Thrones, The Song of Fire and Ice, the George R.R. Martin novels, which is one example of a very large body of text in which there's hyper violence and extraordinary sadism, and it's just a nasty, nasty place. You're thinking, well, what are fans of Game of Thrones getting out of their fandom? Presumably they don't want to go to Westeros. Who would want to live in Westeros, where life is nasty, brutish, and short? It's hard to see how my re-enchantment thesis works for a series like Game of Thrones, or the books that they're based on. What's the appeal of those books? And the other big kind of strand in contemporary fantasy is what they call romantasy. And there you can sort of see it's a fantasy world, but you're getting a love story and romance. But those are often kind of 50 Shades of Grey style stories. They're often quite BDSM, to use the acronym. And that, again, it seems like there's a kind of current of violence that runs through fantasy in the 21st century that I couldn't quite account for, I think, in my thesis.
You had mentioned the authors who were war veterans who suddenly became popular again. And in the United States, we had veterans that were coming back into culture from the Vietnam War. And I encountered many of them, being in Berkeley and San Francisco at that time. And a number of them that I encountered were heavily into the fantasy novels because they needed some escape from the real life horrors that they had just encountered, and that really impacted my whole view of fiction and science fiction. Seeing how it really helped these people kind of deal with what they had dealt with.
Mm.
Well, have you taken any inspiration from Morris Berman? Are you familiar with his work?
Tell me about Morris Berman.
Well, he wrote a book called The Re-Enchantment of the World, and he was sort of talking about this point of how the world has become disenchanted and the question of how we re-enchant it. I mean, it's a long time since I read that book. I would have read it back in the 80s, but I remember I found that argument fairly compelling. And this concept of re-enchantment is not new to me. It's one that I've encountered along the way since then, and recognized it partly because I had seen his work.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I haven't read Berman. I'll check it out. It sounds relevant to my interest. I should have read it. Mind you, I did read the whole of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and that's 40,000 pages long or something. So I feel maybe I was just worn out reading about re-enchantment.
I think there's another book called The Re-Enchantment of Everyday Life. That's by Thomas More, I think.
Okay.
And that one I haven't read. I can't say that I'm familiar with it, but I was kind of aware of it. I mean, I think this is a compelling thing to think about this. We have the way that we frame our lives, the way that we frame reality now is so completely, I don't know, mechanistic, and and maybe even more so as technology becomes more a part of our lives. And I kind of wonder what our path forward is. I wondered, one thing that we sometimes talk about here is what the impact of AI will be. And AI is having an impact on fantasy because people are using AI to construct fantasies and to construct fantastic images and text of fantasy and that sort of thing. And some people are very skeptical about AI, and in many ways, I'm skeptical about AI. But there's no doubt that it's going to have an impact on our culture.
Yeah, I think it's already having an impact. I'm not sure it's going to have a deep impact for precisely these reasons, that it's not, and it cannot be inspired in the way that a human artist can be. It's entirely synthetic. It just takes elements and kind of recombines them and recombines them. And it has had an impact, I suppose, particularly on the kind of visual arts. I don't think I've read an AI story that has convinced me yet.
Well, I mean, it can't be inspired, but can it be inspiring?
Well, I mean, I can only speak to my personal reactions to AI art, unless there's going to be a sudden step change and it's going to suddenly become, you know, be able to write like Shakespeare. And I don't see that happening, but maybe it will. I mean, we have to look into these possibilities. And I do think, I mean, I think what you're saying there, John, is there's a number of different studies that look at disenchantment as a kind of, that's characteristic, that's definitive almost of what modern existence is like, and we all recognize that. And I think that's one of the things that fantasy is about. And I think another thing is, if we think of Tolkien, he's a writer about community, and what's evil in Tolkien's universe is what cuts you off from the community. He takes this ring of invisibility, and the reason you're invisible is because this goes back to Plato. Plato says, well, you know, if we were invisible, if we weren't seen by our fellows, we would commit all sorts of terrible crimes. It's only being seen by others that keeps us kind of moral. So the kind of villains, if you like, the evil in Tolkien's universe is being separated from the community. Gollum living under a mountain for hundreds of years, nursing his ring, and the ring is what turns you into kind of selfish and possessive and kind of separate. Whereas he was a believer, Tolkien, and that's one of the things that comes strongly through in his novels, I think, in how the kind of wholeness of living as part of a community, which was also for him a religious question, because he was a religious writer, being part of a congregation and being part of a faith. And that's something that we see with technology. I mean, it's, in one sense, it's kind of wonderful that the four of us on different sides of the Atlantic are able to have this conversation. But I find myself struck by how atomized society is becoming with all these wonderful technologies, how everyone is just kind of in a little bubble with their own phone, scrolling through whatever's happening on social media. How rarely we now actually get together. And it wouldn't be practical for us physically to get together for this talk, but there are lots of occasions when you're thinking becomes a substitute for actual human contact, and that worries me a little bit.
I was at a talk last night at the Greenwich Skeptics given by a professor at King's College London called Kate Devlin, who researches AI. And she was talking about humans' relationships with chatbots. I mean, her talk was entitled something like "Your AI is not in love with you." But she also talked about the way people sort of feel like they're friends with their AI, and they brainstorm with their AI. And I can actually see where that would work in the sense that John asked if something could be inspiring. That, that you're batting ideas around, and this thing is feeding back related bits and things. If nothing else, it can show you what everyone else has done that you should avoid. But I can see where it might have its usefulness. But she's very interested in the psychology of these relationships and the way people, um, you know, react brokenhearted when somebody turns off a service, or and that's the reality, is humans can have a relationship with anything. We read into things, you know. But the thing I like about the Zoom construct is it gives you access to people you don't have access to in your daily life.
Hmm?
You know.
Yeah, we use Zoom a lot for these conversations, and since Wendy has joined us, she's brought in a lot of people from the UK that we never would have been able to interview otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I just think I suppose I'm remembering the early days of the internet, not AI as such, but just the internet. And suddenly we're all carrying phones that mean we can literally access the entire sum of human knowledge. And that ought to have been a utopian moment when, all the barriers of ignorance fell away, but it
You
didn't
have forgotten Douglas Adams and
really.
the Babel fish that by
Babel fish.
translating everything instantaneously caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, there's something in that, isn't there? But there's also a sense in which we don't use the internet to its full extent. We don't use it to explore the complete range of human knowledge. We use it to look at cat videos and to
Well, we
be
did
smart
for a
about people.
while. I mean, that was great. That was what was great about the internet in the 1990s, was that there was something new and weird every day. And now most people, they get up, they go to Facebook, or they go to their favorite social media site, they read some news, maybe they buy something, and then that's you're on a kind of hamster wheel from one large site to another.
I don't think you can generalize about it either. There are, well, for one thing, the internet is mainstreamed, and there's people who have come onto the internet who I might argue have a fairly limited imagination about how it could be used. Early on, we thought of, I mean, I was part of a group called Fringeware. We published a magazine, and we were all over the place. We were exploring in many nooks and crannies. We would have an issue about Gurdjieff inspired issue, for instance, and then the next issue would be about technology. And there was quite a bit of exploration happening then. I think it's still happening now. I just think that it's less visible, or I mean, it was kind of what was happening on the internet back then, but what's happening on the internet now is very mainstream. You have influencers and you have Instagram users. How much did the internet have a role in the recent Golden Globes, for instance, those awards? It wasn't just something that was televised as a 3-hour show, but it was also, there were tons of things happening in social media, and everybody who was at the awards were kind of shooting their own takes of the awards and publishing those on their sites and so forth. So it has brought people together in a bigger way. Uh, it can bring imaginative people together, but it can also bring unimaginative people together.
But people also default to their particular interests. And what we see in the internet is a whole range, a very large range, but a whole range of kind of silos where people congregate around their particular interests. And that can be great. If you're interested in crochet, you can join up with people all over the world who love crochet and find all sorts of things. In a political sense, it means we end up in our little bubbles. We don't talk to people across the political aisle, and we end up with this kind of fragmented political structure where it seems impossible to think that we could ever get consensus on any issue. And that doesn't seem to me a very good thing. And just to bring it back to fantasy, fantasy is a congeries of different sub kind of fandoms who like particular kinds of fantasy, who like traditional fantasy, or like grimdark, or like weird fantasy, or like romantasy, or like global fantasy, or whatever it might be. Cozy fantasy is quite a big thing at the minute, and they tend to just all hang out in the same chat rooms and the same online spaces, and there's no sense of a kind of larger community.
Did your view of fantasy change much as you were writing this book?
I would say so. I don't think I had a sense, because you can't really not realize how big a deal fantasy's become as a kind of commercial publishing proposition. But until I actually dived in, I hadn't realized just how the enormousness of it and the repetitiveness of it. And I started reading. I'd read a few Dragonlance novels, let's say, when I was a kid, and I thought, well, let's see what's happening with Dragonlance. Dragonlance is 40,000 separate titles, and they're all, each individually, they're all a kind of fantasy kind of world you can read. You read all of them together. Inevitably, there's a great deal of the same thing happening over and over again with slight variations. But it's there because there's this kind of vast appetite for these sorts of books. Dungeons and Dragons and video games, many of which are very kind of fantastical. And then for a while, fantasy couldn't break through onto the big screen. You make a movie about Conan and it would do moderately well, but then you couldn't follow it up until the Lord of the Rings movies came with Peter Jackson at the beginning of the 21st century and made a ton of money. And suddenly there are a whole range of fantasy cinema and TV texts, kind of visualized text, and it's just everywhere. And I found myself drowning in a huge, I was going to say quagmire, but that's not really fair. A lot of it is very bad, but some of it is really good and really interesting. And it does mean, because there's so much of it, that there will be really good examples of any particular form of fantasy that you're interested in. But it took, I kicked myself for agreeing to write the book for a while when I was trying to catch up with all the stuff that was going on over the last 25 years or so.
Well, I am a big fan of Philip K. Dick, who has been labeled really as a sci-fi writer, and I find his work to be really a lot of fantasy as well. It just, the fact that it was made into a successful movie, do androids dream of electric sheep? I just found that some of his novels are very much fantasy, but because it became linked to a sci-fi film, then it, I guess, has relegated him to being labeled.
Yeah, I always think I love Philip K. Dick, and I also think often of what Michael Moorcock said, which is that he regarded, he's still alive, he regards Philip K. Dick.
He lives nearby.
Yeah, he's a great fantasy writer as well.
Yeah.
But he said of Philip K. Dick that Dick was a great philosopher who happened to find in pulp science fiction the proper way of expressing his philosophical ideas. And I like that. I like the idea that if Dick had been born in Germany in the 1790s, he might have written the Critique of Pure Reason, but because he was born in America in the post-war period, he wrote all sorts of kinds of pulp novels to make money, in which he articulated and expressed his really original metaphysical ideas about the nature of reality, about the nature of the world.
Yeah, I sometimes think he wrote nonfiction.
Yeah, yeah.
Scoop lives out near Bastrop, and the last I heard, Michael Moorcock lived there too. He had moved to Texas at one point.
Yeah, no, that's right. He's lived out there for a while now.
Yeah. I was a big fan of Michael Moorcock. It was a big deal to meet him at some point.
Where did you meet him?
There was a bookstore event here. It was a different author, but he showed up,
All
and
right.
I had friends who knew him and introduced me, and uh, it was kind of a big deal, you know. I mean, I had read so many of his earlier books. I I used to go to science fiction conventions quite a bit in the 70s and 80s, especially, and 90s, I suppose. It was kind of interesting. They were labeled science fiction conventions, and many science fiction authors would show up. But the culture of the conventions was very much more oriented to fantasy.
Yeah.
And I never, for the longest time, I didn't understand. I'm starting to understand better why that is. But it was kind of an interesting thing. You really had a set of people who were quite committed to fantasy, but they were also interested in science fiction. And of course, you know, George R. R. Martin would show up here, and at the time he was a science fiction writer.
Yeah, that's right.
And at some point he decided to write fantasy instead.
Well, he started writing fantasy, and then it made him rich beyond the dreams of Chris. So obviously he carries on doing that. You can't blame him for that. I mean, he's been a bit trapped by his own success, I think, George Martin.
Yeah, he's supposed to produce another couple of books, right, in that series, and he's having trouble doing it
Yeah, well,
or
it's
taking time doing it.
taking his time. There's no pressure on him. There's no one can apply pressure to him, can they? As it now goes. But yeah,
Have you seen Vince Gilligan's new series Pluribus?
yeah, I
I mean,
really
because
like
the
that.
lead character of that is a romantasy author with a legion of devoted fans.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And she's really bitter about it, and she hates
Yes,
it more.
yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I like it a lot, and I find her a very interesting character.
Mm.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the fantasy that appears in comic books? If you've ever been to a comic book convention, Comic Con, you talk about wild fantasy and people, you know, living in alternate lives of fantasy. Yeah, it's an interesting culture.
Yeah, and that's right. I do talk about that a little bit, and I think it's comic books and visual culture more broadly defined has become the kind of dominant in fantasy, and that's partly television and cinema, but it's also video games. And video games are such a, I mean, with a video game you can have a fantasy realm like Skyrim, and you can spend weeks just exploring it and having adventures in it. And it's not these aren't adventures that somebody else has determined that you have to follow. You can have your own adventures. And I mean, I'm following video games kind of at second hand. My son is a teenager and he plays video games all the time, and sometimes he'll deign to explain to me what, you know, Dark Souls or Skyrim or whatever it might be is all about. And it
But
does
that
look.
too. Oh, sorry.
So, what were you saying, Wendy?
I was going to say, but this too has a precursor, which was reenactment societies, the Society for Creative Anachronism in the States, and the Viking reenactment people over here. And it's the same thing. It's building a world an alternative world that you live in. And you know, people always used to mock it, and I never understood why.
Mm.
Because you know, why not?
Well, yeah, and kind of board games and
I mean, if
Dungeons and
grown-ups want to
Dragons, but
play
also
dress up, yeah.
exactly, and that's as you know, as John's saying, going to science fiction conventions, a large part of science fiction and fantasy fandom is cosplay, and people will spend a lot of time and a lot of craft and a lot of skill making costumes for their favorite fantasy characters so they can dress up and play at that. And that's the appeal of art broadly, isn't it? It's play. It's imaginatively entering into a world where you can kind of explore and have fun.
Yeah, and in some cases, in some of this Society of Creative Anachronism, people are keeping alive skills that would otherwise be dying out. You know, certain kinds of embroidery and lace making, and also,
Mm.
one of my friends makes illuminated manuscripts. And he
Wow.
puts enormous effort into them. They're absolutely gorgeous, and that's his interpretation of being living in a medieval world. Well, okay.
One thing I've seen in video games is that they're becoming sort of more like movies. And I wonder, I have, I don't actually play video games. Like you, I have a relative, a grandson who's a young adult, but he plays video games. It's actually a pretty big part of his life. Um, and I'm not exactly sure what he's in. He goes into fairly immersive games and has a whole social life involved with those games. But I have seen like ads for games and I've seen some representations of games that make them seem it seems like they're telling the whole story, and I just wonder where the gameplay comes into it.
Yeah, I mean, you're not speaking to an expert in video games, but I understand there are games that are like that, where you have to go on a particular quest or follow a particular story. But then there are sandbox games where you can just go into a world and have adventures in that world. And I mean, I think it may be the other way around. I think it may be that cinema is becoming more like video games, and
I
it's
think
more
it's
about
both ways.
particular special effects, spectacular. That's diminishing, I think, as for the art form, because video games are necessarily structured by the obstacles that you put in the way of the player. The player overcomes the obstacles and gets to the end of the stage and beats the big boss, and that's a rather kind of denuded way of thinking about the possibilities of storytelling. But then I also think that it's a game like Skyrim is you can do anything at all in that. You can fight dragons and you can go on adventures and quests, or you can just live in a village and just explore what the possibilities of that are. And that's rare. It's rare certainly in cinema, but even in book form, where there usually is a more linear conflict that has to be overcome. I suppose a counterexample would be to go back to Ursula Le Guin, Always Coming Home, which is a marvelous novel, and which does have stories and conflicts and things in it, but it's also a kind of compendium of this whole culture, this whole world, which is notionally kind of the future of California, but is post-industrial and therefore kind of pre-industrial and sort of fantasy.
I'm thinking about how early on in the internet, one of the experiments that we saw occasionally was authors that would structure fictions that had multiple paths forward, and they would try to create a fiction where there were, to some extent, the the story that was told, the narrative was determined by the reader. The reader could make choices that would lead them through the story down one path or another. And I suppose that's kind of what video games do now.
Yeah, they do it much better. I mean, I remember a series of books, printed paperbacks called Choose Your Adventure, and some of those were war stories or science fiction, but some of them were fantasy stories. And you would read a paragraph and it would say, you come to the mouth of a cave and you see a man. What do you do? And you're given two options, and depending on which option you choose, you turn to a different page. When I was a kid, I used to, obsessively read and reread and follow all the possible story paths through those. But it's kind of laborious. It's a laborious way of doing that. Whereas video games just do it effortlessly because that's in the nature of the way they're structured.
Have you played video games very much?
Not
yourself?
No, I played when I was younger. I played a few video games on kind of primitive video game consoles, the kind of things my son would turn up his nose in scorn at. And I'll tell you what happened. I played one of the Zelda games where you had to go through, which is again a kind of fantasy kind of kingdom, and you have all sorts of quests and adventures, and you have to get to the middle of this large territory where there's a princess to rescue. And I got to the middle and I finally got to the princess and thought, finally I finished this. And then it turned out that was only halfway, and you go into a sort of subterranean version of the Zelda universe. You have to do the same thing over again with all sorts of different adventures. And I finally got to the end of that, and I completed the game, and I felt for about a minute and a half, I felt tremendous satisfaction that I'd achieved this. And then I just felt, what a waste of time. How many hundreds of hours did I spend playing that game? I could have written a novel in that time. What am I doing? And it is it's chewing gum for the eyes. It's just a way of filling the time. And there are more productive ways. I don't want to sound utilitarian about it, but there are more productive ways of filling the time than playing video games. But then, like you're saying about your grandson, for my son, he's just turned 18. Video games are a huge part of his life, and
and it's a social thing.
Yeah, he plays online with all his friends. It's how he relaxes. He's incredibly, there was a time when he said, well, let's play this game together, Dad. It was one of the Star Wars games. And you could play it split screen so that the two of you were having the same adventure. And he hopped on a sort of floating motorcycle and zoomed off into the distance. And I couldn't get my floating motorcycle to work. So I was just stuck there. And he kept saying, well, hurry up there, catch up. I'm fighting a monster over here. I need your help. And it's like, I can't work this. And he gave up on me after that. So I don't really play video games. So I do feel I'm missing out on a large part of contemporary culture by not being part of that world. But then there are only so many hours in the day. So I'm not sure what you can do.
Well, and you're a prolific author. I'm surprised you have time to do what you do.
Well, yeah. No, that's all. There's a young lad in Malaysia. I pay him to write all my novels. I get it, but it's
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way we got here is I read The Thing Itself, and then I read The Lake of Darkness.
Oh, wow.
And I mentioned to Wendy, I said, "Wow, I wonder if we could get Adam Roberts to join us," and it happened. So I thank you so much for joining us. Our hour is up.
Oh,
and I hope you'll come back sometime. Yeah, I know. It was great.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great. I've had a blast. I'd love to come back.
Okay. Well, we'll invite you back. Thank you so much.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.